Some inheritances come with a price that money can't measure. Eleanor Hartwell stood before the towering iron gates of Blackmoor Estate, rain drumming against her umbrella as the October wind whipped through the ancient pine trees of coastal Maine. For $10, the most bizarre inheritance clause her lawyer had ever seen, this crumbling Victorian mansion was now hers. 7 years of scraping by since her husband's death, 7 years of sleepless nights in a cramped Boston studio, and now at 34, 8 months pregnant and alone, she was staring at salvation wrapped in moss and mystery. The house loomed against the storm clouds like something from a Gothic nightmare, its windows dark except for one, a warm golden light flickering in what appeared to be the kitchen. Eleanor's forensic accountant mind immediately flagged the impossibility. The estate had been abandoned for decades, with no electrical service. Yet there it was, that inviting glow cutting through the darkness. As she pushed open the heavy oak door, the scent of fresh bread and lavender hit her like a memory she'd never lived. The hallway stretched before her, lined with photographs of women who looked disturbingly familiar. Women with her exact green eyes, her sharp cheekbones, her auburn hair. Each woman stood in this very doorway, each woman clearly pregnant, each woman smiling as if they'd finally come home. But who were they? And why did Eleanor feel like she was looking into a mirror that reflected across time itself? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Eleanor's hand trembled as she traced the ornate frame of the nearest photograph. The woman staring back at her could have been her twin, same constellation of freckles across the bridge of her nose, same stubborn cowlick that refused to lie flat no matter how much product she used. But the clothing was wrong, the hairstyle decades out of place. This woman wore a 1,940 seconds victory roll and a floral house dress that Eleanor recognized from old movies. The baby kicked hard against her ribs, as if responding to her spike of unease. She pressed a protective hand to her swollen belly, whispering the same words she'd been repeating for months. "It's okay, little one. We're going to be fine." Thunder crashed overhead, and the golden light from the kitchen flickered. Eleanor's practical mind catalogued the impossibilities. No power lines ran to the estate according to the property records she'd obsessively reviewed. The water had been shut off years ago. Yet the house felt lived in, warm despite the October chill seeping through the walls. She moved deeper into the hallway, her footsteps muffled by a Persian runner that should have been moth-eaten after decades of abandonment, but instead felt plush beneath her feet. More photographs lined the walls, dozens of them. A woman in Victorian dress with bustles and high collars. Another in a 1920s drop-waist gown, her hand resting on a barely visible bump. A third in 1960s mod fashion, her pregnant silhouette unmistakable beneath the A-line dress. All of them her face. All of them in this doorway. All of them with that same serene smile she'd caught herself wearing in the mirror lately. The expression of someone who'd finally found where they belonged. Eleanor pulled out her phone to take pictures, but the screen remained stubbornly black. Dead battery, though she'd charged it fully before the drive from Boston. The isolation pressed against her like a physical weight. No cell service, no power, no way to contact anyone if something went wrong. If the baby decided to come early. She forced herself to breathe slowly, the way Dr. Martinez had taught her during the panic attacks that had plagued her since David's death. In for 4 counts, hold for 4, out for 4. The forensic accounting firm where she'd worked had been understanding about the anxiety, right up until the point they weren't. Pregnant, unreliable, prone to crying jags when numbers didn't add up. She'd seen the writing on the wall before. They'd gently suggested she take early maternity leave. That's when the inheritance notice had arrived, like an answer to prayers she'd been too proud to pray. The kitchen doorway beckoned ahead, that impossible warm light spilling across hardwood floors that gleamed as if freshly polished. Eleanor approached slowly, one hand trailing along the wainscoting for support. The baby was sitting low today, pressing against her bladder and making her lower back ache with each step. She paused at the threshold, struck by a wave of déjà vu so powerful it left her dizzy. The kitchen spread before her like a 1950s magazine advertisement. Checkered linoleum floors, mint green appliances, yellow curtains tied with gingham bows. On the formica table sat a place setting for one, delicate china painted with roses, a crystal glass filled with what looked like fresh milk, a plate of pot roast and mashed potatoes still steaming. The impossibility of it should have sent her running. Instead, Eleanor found herself stepping into the warmth, drawn by a hunger that went deeper than her empty stomach. She hadn't eaten since morning, too nervous about the drive to manage more than toast and weak tea. The scent of the meal, savory gravy, butter-whipped potatoes, green beans with almonds, made her mouth water. A folded piece of paper leaned against the milk glass, her name written across it in elegant cursive. Eleanor's hands shook as she opened it. "Welcome home, dear one. You must be exhausted from your journey. Please eat, you're feeding too now, and the house has been preparing for your arrival. Your room is ready upstairs, third door on the right. Rest well. Tomorrow we'll begin." The paper felt old between her fingers, the edges yellowed and brittle despite the fresh ink. No signature, no explanation of who we might be. The rational part of her mind, the part that had spent years tracking financial discrepancies and uncovering hidden assets, screamed warnings. This was wrong, impossible, dangerous. But the tired, pregnant, desperate part whispered something else entirely. She was hungry, exhausted, and alone. The storm was getting worse, and her car barely had enough gas to make it back to town. What choice did she have? Eleanor pulled out the chair and sat heavily, her body grateful for the support. The milk was cold and sweet, exactly how she'd craved it for weeks. The pot roast melted on her tongue, seasoned perfectly with herbs she couldn't name but somehow recognized. Outside, the wind howled through the pines, but inside Blackmoor Estate, Eleanor Hartwell ate her first home-cooked meal in 7 years and tried not to think about who had prepared it. The first light of dawn filtered through lace curtains that Eleanor didn't remember closing. She lay in the four-poster bed, disoriented, her hand instinctively moving to her belly where the baby stirred restlessly. The room was exactly as the note had promised, third door on the right, furnished with antique pieces that belonged in a museum. A vanity with a trifold mirror, a wardrobe that smelled of cedar and lavender, photographs on the nightstand showing the same impossible faces she'd seen downstairs. Eleanor's phone buzzed against the nightstand, startling her. The battery showed full charge now, though she was certain it had been dead. 3 missed calls from Marcus, her only remaining friend from the accounting firm. 2 voicemails from Dr. Martinez's office about her missed appointment yesterday, a text from her landlord about the overdue rent notice she'd left unopened on her kitchen counter in Boston. The real world crashed back like cold water. She'd fled here on impulse, drawn by desperation and the promise of a $10 mansion that could solve her housing crisis. But she had a life to return to, threadbare though it was. The first voicemail was Marcus, his voice tight with concern. "Elle, you missed the partner meeting. They're asking questions about the Hendricks audit. Call me back." The second, seriously, "Where are you? Janet's making noise about your unreliable attendance patterns again. I covered for you, said you had a doctor's appointment, but I can't keep doing this." Eleanor closed her eyes, remembering the cramped cubicle that had become her world after David's death. The way her colleagues' conversations stopped when she walked by, how they looked at her growing belly with a mixture of pity and annoyance. The Hartwell name had once meant something in Boston's financial district. David's family had built their reputation on discretion and precision. Now it was just a reminder of spectacular failure. She thought of her studio apartment with its broken heater and neighbors who played music until 3 a.m. The eviction notice would be posted by now. She'd gambled everything on this trip, using her last tank of gas and the final $20 in her checking account. If this inheritance was some cruel hoax, she'd have nowhere left to go. The baby kicked, a sharp jab under her ribs that made her wince. 8 months and counting. Dr. Martinez had been clear about the complications that could arise for a woman her age, especially one under severe stress. Eleanor had been 34 for exactly 2 weeks. and every day felt like borrowed time. She'd tried to get pregnant for 6 years while David was alive, enduring test after test, procedure after procedure, watching him sink deeper into debt trying to pay for treatments their insurance wouldn't cover. Now, with no husband, no stable income, and no family to speak of, she was finally carrying the child they'd both wanted so desperately. The irony was almost laughable. Eleanor pulled herself from the surprisingly comfortable bed and padded to the window. The storm had passed, leaving the grounds covered in a carpet of scarlet and gold leaves. The morning light revealed details she'd missed in last night's darkness. A garden that should have been overgrown but instead showed signs of recent care. Windows that gleamed despite decades of supposed abandonment. A mailbox at the end of the drive that looked freshly painted. Someone was maintaining this place. The question was who and why they were staying hidden. Her stomach rumbled, reminding her of the impossible dinner she'd eaten. In daylight, the memory felt surreal. She'd been so exhausted, so overwhelmed by the photographs and the storm and her own circumstances, that she'd convinced herself the meal was real. But houses didn't prepare dinners for unexpected guests. Houses didn't leave welcome notes in elegant cursive. Eleanor made her way downstairs, her hand trailing along the banister for support. Each step brought a fresh wave of recognition, as if she'd climbed these stairs 1,000 times before. The kitchen was empty now, the table cleared, no sign of last night's feast. But the dishes sat clean and dry in the rack beside the sink, and when she opened the refrigerator, it hummed to life, revealing shelves stocked with fresh groceries, milk dated today, eggs, bread, fruit that looked like it had been picked that morning. This wasn't abandonment. This was preparation. Eleanor's phone rang, jolting her from her thoughts. Dr. Martinez's office, probably wondering why she'd missed her weekly checkup. She should answer, should explain about the inheritance and the drive to Maine, should ask about traveling this far from Boston so close to her due date. Instead, she let it ring. The sound felt harsh and intrusive in the kitchen's peaceful atmosphere. When it finally stopped, the silence wrapped around her like an embrace. No traffic noise, no sirens, no arguments from neighboring apartments, just the gentle tick of a grandfather clock somewhere in the house and the whisper of wind through pine trees. For the first time in 7 years, Eleanor Hartwell felt like she might actually be home. The peaceful moment shattered when Eleanor heard the crunch of gravel outside. A car door slammed with a finality that sent ice through her veins. She moved to the kitchen window, pushing aside the gingham curtains to peer out at the circular drive. A black sedan sat beside her battered Honda, its windows tinted too dark to see inside. Government plates. Eleanor's forensic accounting background had trained her to notice such details, and federal investigators had a particular way of parking, angled for quick departure, never blocking their target's escape route. Not that she had anywhere to run. 3 figures emerged from the vehicle, 2 men in dark suits that screamed FBI, and a woman with silver hair pulled into a severe bun. Eleanor recognized the type, the kind of investigator who'd built her career on finding what others wanted to stay hidden. The baby kicked frantically, responding to Eleanor's spiking heart rate. She pressed her hand to her belly, whispering reassurances that felt hollow even to her own ears. "It's okay, little one. We haven't done anything wrong." But even as she said it, Eleanor's mind raced through the possibilities. The inheritance itself had seemed too good to be true. Who sold a mansion for $10? The IRS alone should have been asking questions about gift tax implications. Then there were the financial irregularities she'd noticed in David's old files before his death, discrepancies she'd been too grief-stricken to pursue. Had someone finally connected those dots? The knock came firm and authoritative. 3 sharp raps followed by a pause, then 3 more. Eleanor considered not answering, but the sedan blocked her only exit, and pregnant women didn't exactly blend into forest landscapes. She smoothed her wrinkled maternity top and walked slowly to the front door, buying herself time to think. The woman stood front and center, flanked by her suited companions. Up close, Eleanor could see the badge clipped to her belt and the calculating intelligence in her pale blue eyes. This wasn't a routine inquiry. Ms. Hartwell? The woman's voice carried a slight southern accent, professionally modulated. I'm Agent Sarah Blackwood with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. These are Agents Chen and Rodriguez. We'd like to speak with you about your recent inheritance. Eleanor's mouth went dry. What about it? Everything was handled through proper legal channels. I have the documentation. May we come in? Agent Blackwood's tone suggested it wasn't really a question. Her gaze swept over Eleanor's pregnant form with something that might have been sympathy. This conversation would be more comfortable sitting down. Eleanor stepped aside, her mind spinning. The agents entered with the careful awareness of people trained to notice everything. Escape routes, potential weapons, hiding places. Agent Chen's eyes lingered on the photographs lining the hallway, while Rodriguez pulled out a small recording device. In the parlor, Eleanor settled heavily into a wingback chair that felt familiar beneath her hands. The agents remained standing, a classic intimidation technique that David had warned her about during his own legal troubles. Ms. Hartwell, Agent Blackwood began, consulting a thick file folder. Are you aware that Blackmoor Estate has been the subject of a federal investigation for the past 18 months? The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Investigation? For what? Money laundering, tax evasion, fraud. The property has changed hands 17 times in the past century, always sold for minimal amounts to women matching your specific demographic profile. Blackwood's eyes dropped to Eleanor's belly. Pregnant women facing financial hardship. Eleanor felt the walls of the room pressing closer. I don't understand. The inheritance was legitimate. I have the will, the legal transfer documents. All forged, Agent Rodriguez interjected, his voice clipped. Expertly done, but forged nonetheless. The real question, Miss Hartwell, is whether you're a victim or an accomplice. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Eleanor's hands shook as she gripped the chair arms. Accomplice to what? I've never even been to Maine before yesterday. I didn't know this place existed until I received the inheritance notice. Agent Blackwood leaned forward, her expression suddenly intense. That notice, do you still have it? Eleanor nodded toward her purse on the side table. Agent Chen retrieved it with gloved hands, carefully extracting the cream-colored envelope that had changed everything. As he opened it, his expression shifted from professional interest to confusion. Ma'am, he said slowly, this envelope is empty. Eleanor's blood turned to ice. She'd read that letter dozens of times, memorized every word about the generous benefactor who'd chosen her specifically. The letter had been her lifeline, her proof that someone believed she deserved better than the cramped existence she'd been barely surviving. That's impossible, she whispered. But even as she spoke, she could see the hollow truth in Chen's eyes. Agent Blackwood studied Eleanor's face with the intensity of someone reading a complex financial statement. Miss Hartwell, I need to ask you directly, how did you know to come here? The question hung between them like a challenge. Eleanor opened her mouth to explain about the letter, the inheritance, the desperate hope that had driven her north through the storm. But the words died in her throat as she realized she had no proof of any of it. The house seemed to hold its breath around them, waiting to see which path she would choose. The silence stretched until it became another presence in the room. Eleanor stared at the empty envelope in Agent Chen's gloved hands, her mind fracturing into 1,000 questions she couldn't voice. The letter had been real. She'd touched it, read it, folded it carefully back into the envelope after each desperate review. She could still recite passages from memory. Your strength in the face of adversity has not gone unnoticed. A sanctuary where you and your child can begin anew. But empty envelopes told a different story. Empty envelopes suggested delusion, or worse, complicity in whatever scheme these agents believed they'd uncovered. Eleanor began, then stopped. Every forensic accounting instinct screamed at her to remain silent, to demand a lawyer, to protect herself from whatever trap was closing around her. She'd seen too many people talk themselves into federal charges by trying to explain the inexplicable. David had made that mistake during his final audit, offering theories and justifications that only made him look more guilty. Agent Blackwood's pale eyes never wavered. "Take your time, Miss Hartwell, but understand that 17 women before you have sat in this same room, all claiming the same story, all insisting they received legitimate inheritance notices, all pregnant, all desperate, all unable to provide any concrete proof of how they really came to be here. 17. The number hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The photographs in the hallway suddenly took on a sinister cast, not mysterious family resemblances, but evidence of a pattern spanning decades. A trap she'd walked into with her eyes wide shut. The baby pressed against her ribs, a sharp reminder of everything she stood to lose. If these agents arrested her, what would happen to her child? Foster care? Adoption? She'd grown up in the system herself after her parents died in a car crash when she was 12. She knew the statistics, the outcomes, the particular cruelties inflicted on children who became wards of the state. "What happened to them?" Eleanor whispered. "The other women?" Agent Rodriguez shifted uncomfortably. "That's what we're trying to determine. Some left voluntarily after our interviews. Others—" He glanced at Blackwood, who gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head. "Others we lost track of." Lost track of. The euphemism sent chills down Eleanor's spine. Federal agents didn't lose track of people in active investigations unless those people didn't want to be found, or couldn't be found. Eleanor's phone buzzed in her purse. Probably Marcus again, or Dr. Martinez's office, or her landlord. The real world. Calling her back to a life that was falling apart even faster than she'd feared. If she left with these agents now, she'd return to Boston as a person of interest in a federal investigation. Her eviction would proceed. The accounting firm would terminate her immediately. She'd give birth in a county hospital with no insurance and no support system, then try to raise a child in whatever shelter would take them. But if she stayed here, in this house where 17 other women had vanished— "I need to use the bathroom," Eleanor said suddenly, pushing herself up from the chair with visible effort. The agents exchanged glances. Pregnant women were difficult to deny basic human needs, and she was counting on that. Agent Blackwood nodded curtly. "Agent Chen will escort you." Eleanor made her way slowly up the familiar staircase, Agent Chen trailing at a respectful distance. The bathroom was where she remembered it, though she couldn't recall actually seeing it yesterday. Everything about this place felt like a half-remembered dream, details that shouldn't exist but did. She locked the door and sat heavily on the edge of the antique clawfoot tub, her hands shaking as she pulled out her phone. Marcus had left 2 more voicemails. The first was professional concern. "Elle, they're asking about the Hendricks file again. You need to call me." The second carried a note of genuine fear. "There are federal agents at the office asking about you." "Jesus, Elle, what have you gotten into?" Eleanor closed her eyes, her head pounding. The smart play was obvious. Go with the agents, cooperate fully, hope her ignorance was genuine enough to keep her out of prison. Let them unravel whatever conspiracy had ensnared 17 other women. Trust the system that had failed her so completely after David's death. But as she sat in that bathroom, surrounded by wallpaper that felt familiar as her own skin, Eleanor realized something that made her blood run cold. She didn't want to leave. Despite everything, the empty envelope, the federal investigation, the 17 missing women, some part of her still felt safer in this impossible house than anywhere else in the world. That realization terrified her more than any government badge. The baby kicked again, insistent, as if sensing her turmoil. Eleanor pressed both hands to her belly and whispered a question she wasn't sure she wanted answered. What kind of mother chooses a haunted house over her child's safety? From downstairs, Agent Blackwood's voice carried up the stairs. "Miss Hartwell, we need to continue this conversation." Eleanor stared at her reflection in the antique mirror above the sink, watching a stranger look back at her with hollow eyes and trembling lips. Agent Chen's polite cough from the hallway reminded her that time was running out. In moments, she'd have to walk back downstairs and make a choice that would define not just her future, but her child's. The smart choice, the safe choice. Go with the agents, cooperate, trust the system. But Eleanor had trusted the system before. She'd trusted it when David's business partners vanished with their savings. She'd trusted it when the bank foreclosed on their home while David lay dying in a hospital bed, insurance refusing to cover experimental treatments. She'd trusted it when social services promised help for pregnant widows, then buried her in paperwork and waiting lists. The system hadn't saved her husband. It wouldn't save her now. Miss Hartwell? Agent Chen's voice held a note of warning. Eleanor pressed her palms against the cool porcelain sink, steadying herself. Through the bathroom window, she could see the forest stretching endlessly in all directions, a wilderness that could swallow a person completely. The agents had said they'd lost track of women before. Maybe that hadn't been failure. Maybe it had been choice. She opened the bathroom door to find Agent Chen studying one of the hallway photographs with obvious discomfort. The woman in the frame could have been Eleanor's twin. Same dark hair, same determined chin, same protective hand curved over a swollen belly. But the photograph was sepia-toned, from an era when women wore long skirts and high collars. Uncanny resemblance, Chen murmured, not quite meeting Eleanor's eyes. Eleanor nodded, moving past him toward the stairs. Each step felt weighted with significance, as if the house itself was holding its breath. In the parlor, Agents Blackwood and Rodriguez stood by the front windows, speaking in low voices. They turned as Eleanor entered, their expressions professionally neutral but watchful. "Feel better?" Agent Blackwood asked, though her tone suggested she knew exactly what Eleanor had been doing upstairs. "Actually, yes." Eleanor settled back into the wingback chair, surprised to find her hands had stopped shaking. The terror was still there, but underneath it lay something else, a strange calm that felt like acceptance. "I've made a decision." Agent Rodriguez pulled out his recording device again. "We're listening." Eleanor took a deep breath, feeling the baby shift as if to remind her they were in this together. "I'm not leaving." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Agent Blackwood's eyebrows rose slightly. "Miss Hartwell, I don't think you understand the gravity of this situation. You're potentially a material witness in a federal investigation. We can compel your cooperation. Can you?" Eleanor met the agent's stare without flinching. "I haven't committed any crimes. I received what I believed to be a legitimate inheritance notice and acted accordingly. If that notice was fraudulent, I'm a victim, not a perpetrator." Agent Chen returned to the parlor, his expression troubled. "Ma'am, the other women who chose to stay here, we never heard from them again. No credit card activity, no phone usage, no contact with family or friends. They simply vanished." Eleanor felt a chill, but also something that might have been relief. Maybe they found what they were looking for. Or maybe they're dead, Rodriguez said bluntly. The possibility should have terrified her. A month ago, it would have sent her racing for the nearest exit. But sitting in this room, surrounded by the scent of lavender and old roses, watching dust motes dance in afternoon sunlight that made everything golden and warm, Eleanor realized she'd been dead for 7 years already. Since David's diagnosis, she'd been moving through life like a ghost, going through the motions of existence without truly living. "I understand the risks," she said quietly, "but I also understand what's waiting for me back in Boston. Eviction, unemployment, giving birth alone in a county hospital, raising my child in poverty while creditors circle like vultures." She looked down at her belly, her voice softening. "At least here, there's a chance at something different." Agent Blackwood closed her file with a sharp snap. "Ms. Hartwell, you're making a potentially fatal mistake based on sentiment and desperation, maybe." Eleanor smiled, and the expression felt genuine for the first time in months. "But it's my mistake to make." The agents exchanged glances heavy with meaning. They'd clearly had this conversation before, with 17 other women who'd made the same impossible choice. Eleanor wondered if any of them had felt this same sense of rightness, as if pieces of a puzzle were finally clicking into place. "We'll be watching this property," Blackwood warned, pocketing her recorder. "Any unusual activity, any sign of foul play, and we'll be back with warrants and backup." Eleanor nodded. "I understand." As the agents filed out, Agent Chen paused in the doorway. Miss Hartwell, if you change your mind, if you want to leave, don't wait. Don't overthink it. Just go. The front door closed with a finality that echoed through the house like a death knell. Eleanor remained in the wing-back chair, listening to the sedan's engine fade into the distance until only silence remained. She was alone now, truly alone, perhaps for the first time in her life. The house seemed to exhale around her, and Eleanor could have sworn she heard the faintest whisper of welcome carried on the autumn breeze. The silence that followed the agent's departure felt different from any quiet Eleanor had ever experienced. It wasn't the hollow emptiness of her Boston apartment, or the sterile hush of hospital corridors during David's final days. This silence had weight, texture, like a living thing that had been holding its breath and could finally exhale. Eleanor remained in the wing-back chair, her hands resting on her belly as the baby shifted restlessly inside her. The afternoon light streaming through the parlor windows had taken on a golden quality that made everything look dreamlike, as if she'd stepped through a veil into some other version of reality. A soft thump from upstairs broke the spell. Eleanor's breath caught. The sound was distinct, not the settling of old wood or the skitter of mice in the walls, but something purposeful, deliberate, as if someone had dropped a book or knocked over a picture frame. Another sound followed, the whisper of footsteps across floorboards. Eleanor's forensic mind immediately catalogued the possibilities. The agents could have left someone behind to watch the house. There might be homeless people squatting in the upper rooms. The property could have a caretaker she hadn't been told about. All logical explanations for what she was hearing. But logic couldn't explain why her heart rate had actually slowed instead of spiked, or why she felt more curious than afraid. The footsteps moved across the ceiling again, heading toward what she remembered as the master bedroom. Eleanor pushed herself up from the chair with some effort, her body protesting the movement after sitting so long. She made her way to the foot of the stairs, one hand on the banister, listening. "Hello?" she called softly. "Is someone there?" The footsteps stopped immediately, as if whoever was upstairs had also frozen to listen. The silence stretched for long moments before Eleanor heard something that made her skin prickle. A woman's voice, so faint it might have been imagination, calling back, "Eleanor." Not a question of identity, but recognition. As if whoever was upstairs had been expecting her specifically. Eleanor gripped the banister tighter, her practical mind warring with an inexplicable sense of rightness. She should call the police, should grab her car keys and leave immediately, just as Agent Chen had warned, should trust her survival instincts instead of whatever strange magnetism was drawing her deeper into this house's mysteries. Instead, she began climbing the stairs. Each step felt like a small surrender, another choice that carried her further from the rational world and deeper into something that defied explanation. The worn carpet muffled her footsteps, but she could hear her own breathing, slightly labored from the climb and her pregnancy. At the top of the stairs, Eleanor paused. The hallway stretched in both directions, lined with those uncanny photographs that seemed to watch her pass. The master bedroom door, which she was certain had been closed earlier, now stood slightly ajar. "I know you're there," Eleanor said, surprised by how steady her voice sounded. "The agents are gone. We can talk." A long pause, then the door creaked open wider. Eleanor approached slowly, her heart hammering not with fear but with anticipation, as if she were about to solve a puzzle that had been haunting her for years. The bedroom was empty, but someone had clearly been there. The dust covers had been pulled from the furniture, revealing an ornate four-poster bed with intricate carved posts and a quilted coverlet that looked handmade. A vanity table held an antique silver brush set, and in the mirror, Eleanor caught a glimpse of movement that made her spin around. Nothing. Just afternoon shadows shifting as clouds passed over the sun. But on the vanity table, something that definitely hadn't been there before. A leather-bound journal, open to a page covered in familiar handwriting. Eleanor's handwriting, though she'd never seen this book before in her life. With trembling fingers, she lifted the journal and read the words written in her own careful script. October 15th. They came today, the agents, asked the same questions, made the same threats, But I chose to stay, just as she did, and she before her. The house remembers us all, but it's been waiting longest for me, for Eleanor. The others were practice, preparation. I can feel it now, the purpose behind everything, the empty envelope, the inheritance that couldn't exist, the photographs that span decades but show the same face, the same hope, the same desperate need for sanctuary. Eleanor's hands shook as she turned the page. The baby will come soon. Tomorrow, perhaps. The house is ready. The room downstairs, behind the kitchen. I found it today. 17 cradles, each one carved from wood that grows only on this land. 17 women who came here pregnant and afraid, seeking shelter from a world that had taken everything else. But we're not gone. We're here, waiting, preparing, making ready for the 18th. For Eleanor. Eleanor dropped the journal, her heart hammering against her ribs. The baby kicked violently, as if responding to her terror, and she backed toward the bedroom door. "No," she whispered. "No, this can't be." But even as denial spilled from her lips, part of her recognized the truth in those impossible words. The house had been waiting for her, and she was finally home. The journal lay where she dropped it, pages splayed against the Persian rug like broken wings. Eleanor stared at the impossible words written in her own hand, her mind fracturing as it tried to reconcile what she was seeing with any version of reality that made sense. She stumbled backward until her shoulders hit the doorframe, her breath coming in short gasps that had nothing to do with the baby pressing against her lungs. The handwriting was unmistakably hers, the careful loops of her E's, the way she crossed her T's slightly off-center, the particular slant that had driven her third-grade teacher to distraction. But the ink looked fresh, as if she'd written those words moments ago, and she had no memory of ever holding that journal. The baby kicked hard enough to make her gasp, a sharp reminder that whatever was happening to her would affect them both. Eleanor pressed both hands to her belly, trying to ground herself in the physical reality of her pregnancy, but even that felt uncertain now. If she could write in a journal she'd never seen, if she could inherit a house that had been waiting for her specifically, what other impossibilities might be true? A board creaked somewhere behind her, and Eleanor spun toward the hallway. The photographs lining the walls seemed to pulse in her peripheral vision, 17 faces that wore her own features across decades of different clothing and hairstyles. She'd dismissed them earlier as coincidence, family resemblance, but now she saw them for what they truly were, a record. Evidence of a pattern that stretched back over a century. "Think," she whispered to herself, falling back on the analytical skills that had made her a good forensic accountant. There has to be a logical explanation, but logic was a luxury she could no longer afford. Logic belonged to the world she'd left behind in Boston, where eviction notices and federal investigations were the worst things that could happen to a person. This house operated by different rules entirely. Eleanor forced herself to walk back to the vanity, each step an act of will. The journal lay open to that impossible page, the words seeming to shimmer in the afternoon light. She knelt carefully beside it, her pregnant body protesting the movement, and read the entry again. The room downstairs behind the kitchen. Her hands shook as she turned the page, revealing more entries in that same familiar handwriting. Dates spanning weeks, months, describing daily life in the house with the casual intimacy of someone who belonged there. References to morning sickness, to doctors in the nearby town, to feeling the baby move for the first time. A pregnancy documented in detail, but not her pregnancy, not her memories. The final entry made her blood freeze. October 16th. I understand now. We are not separate women who happen to find this place. We are echoes of the same soul, drawn here across time to fulfill the same purpose. The house doesn't trap us, it completes us. Tomorrow I will go to the room behind the kitchen, and I will take my place among the others. Eleanor will come eventually. She always does. And when she arrives, she will read these words and understand that she is not discovering our story. She is remembering it. Eleanor slammed the journal shut, but the words burned behind her eyelids. She struggled to her feet, her body moving with dreamlike slowness, and backed away from the vanity as if it might bite her. The house around her felt different now. Not empty, but full of watching presence. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, more purposeful. The very air hummed with expectation, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. She had to see the room behind the kitchen. The knowledge hit her like a physical blow, inevitable as gravity. Whatever rational part of her mind was screaming warnings couldn't compete with the certainty that flooded through her bones. She needed to see those 17 cradles, needed to understand what she was walking toward, or what she was walking back to. Eleanor made her way downstairs with careful steps, one hand trailing along the banister for support. The kitchen was exactly as she'd left it that morning, sunlight streaming through gingham curtains, the impossible fresh milk still cold in the refrigerator. But now she noticed things that hadn't registered before, the way the room felt incomplete, as if it were missing something essential, the way her eyes kept drifting to the far wall, where a narrow door stood slightly ajar. She'd assumed it was a pantry. Now she knew better. The door opened at her touch, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. The air that wafted up carried the scent of old wood and something else, something sweet and organic that reminded her of a nursery. Eleanor reached for the light switch with fingers that felt disconnected from her body. The bulb that flickered to life was old and dim, but it revealed enough. 17 small cradles arranged in a perfect circle, each one carved from dark wood that seemed to absorb the light. And in the center, an 18th cradle, empty and waiting, for her baby, for Eleanor's child, for the continuation of a pattern that had been playing out for over a century. Eleanor gripped the doorframe, her legs threatening to give out as understanding crashed over her in waves. She wasn't discovering this place's secrets, she was remembering them. And somewhere in the darkness behind those cradles, she could swear she heard the soft sound of 17 women breathing. Eleanor's scream died in her throat as the breathing sounds grew clearer, not threatening but somehow welcoming, like a lullaby hummed by invisible mouths. Her forensic mind, the part that had dissected financial crimes and unraveled corporate deceptions, finally shattered completely under the weight of what she was witnessing. The cradles weren't empty. In the dim light, she could make out shapes within each one, not bodies, but impressions, as if the wood itself remembered what it had once held. The air grew thick with the scent of talcum powder and breast milk, of sleepless nights and desperate love. Eleanor's hand moved instinctively to her belly as the baby kicked violently, responding to her terror with movements that felt almost frantic. "No," she whispered, but the word came out wrong, distorted, as if spoken through water. "This isn't real. This can't be real." But even as denial spilled from her lips, her feet carried her down the narrow stairs. Each step felt predetermined, as inevitable as her heartbeat. The wooden steps creaked under her weight with sounds that seemed familiar, as if she'd walked this path countless times before. When she reached the bottom, the breathing stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, pressing against her eardrums until she thought they might burst. Eleanor stood among the 17 cradles, her pregnant form casting long shadows in the weak light, and felt the weight of over a century's worth of desperation and hope settling around her shoulders like a shroud. The central cradle, her cradle, gleamed with fresh polish. Unlike the others, which bore the patina of decades, this one looked as if it had been completed yesterday. Eleanor approached it with the slow, measured steps of a woman walking to her own execution, one hand trailing along the carved edges of the surrounding cradles. Each touch sent images flooding through her mind, a woman in a 1920s drop-waist dress, sobbing as she rocked an empty cradle, another in 1940s victory rolls, humming a lullaby to the darkness, a third in 1960s paisley, a face streaked with tears that might have been joy or despair. 17 women, 17 pregnancies, 17 hopes that had led them to this underground nursery where time meant nothing and patterns repeated endlessly. When Eleanor's fingers found the 18th cradle, the vision that crashed over her was different. It was herself, but not herself, standing in this exact spot, her belly round with pregnancy, her face serene with acceptance. She was placing something in the cradle, something small and precious, and when the other Eleanor looked up, her eyes held a peace that the real Eleanor had never known. "We've been waiting for you to remember," a voice said behind her. Eleanor spun around, her heart hammering against her ribs. A woman stood at the foot of the stairs, young, maybe 25, wearing a simple blue dress that could have been from any decade. Her face was Eleanor's face, but softer somehow, as if all the sharp edges of fear and grief had been worn smooth. "You're not real," Eleanor managed. The woman smiled, and it was Eleanor's smile reflected back at her. "Neither are you in the way you mean. We're all echoes, Eleanor. Reflections of the same soul seeking the same thing across time. Peace, purpose, a place where our children can be safe." More figures materialized from the shadows, women in clothing spanning decades, all wearing Eleanor's face with subtle variations. Some held babies that flickered in and out of visibility like candle flames. Others cradled empty air with the tenderness of new mothers. "This is impossible," Eleanor whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. After days of impossibilities, the $10 inheritance, the fresh food in an empty house, the photographs that defied explanation. What was one more? "The house found us because we needed to be found," said another woman, this one in 1950s pastels. "We were all pregnant, all alone, all desperate for sanctuary. It gave us what we needed most." "What happened to your babies?" Eleanor's voice cracked on the question. The women exchanged glances full of secrets. "They're safe," the first woman said. "Safer than they ever could have been in the world we came from. The world of evictions and poverty, of husbands who die too young and leave us with nothing but debt and despair." Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, though she couldn't remember starting to cry. "I want my baby to live, to really live, not just exist." "She will," said a woman in Victorian dress, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had seen the pattern play out many times before. "Here, in this place between places, time moves differently. A mother's love becomes eternal. A child's potential becomes infinite." The baby kicked again, but this time the movement felt different. Not panicked, but responding to something Eleanor couldn't sense, as if her child was listening to voices she couldn't yet hear. "All you have to do," said the first woman, stepping closer, "is remember who you really are. Remember why you came here. Remember that some destinies are written in love, not tragedy." Eleanor looked around at the 17 cradles, at the faces that were her face, at the choice that wasn't really a choice at all. The pattern was waiting to complete itself. And despite everything her rational mind screamed in protest, Eleanor finally understood that she had come home. Eleanor reached toward the 18th cradle, her fingers trembling as they traced the fresh-carved wood. The moment her skin made contact, the underground room exploded with light and sound. Babies crying, women weeping, the thunderous crash of something vast and hungry finally claiming what it had been promised. "Yes," whispered the woman in blue, her voice multiplying into a chorus. "Complete the pattern, Eleanor. Take your place." But as Eleanor's hand settled on the cradle's edge, a different memory surged through her. Not the false visions the house had been feeding her, but something real. David's voice on their last night together, raw with desperation. "Promise me you'll fight for our baby. Promise me you won't give up, no matter how hopeless it seems." The clarity hit her like ice water. These weren't echoes of her soul across time. These were the house's previous victims, wearing her face because that's what it needed her to see. The cradles weren't sanctuaries. They were prisons. Eleanor jerked her hand back, stumbling away from the central cradle. "You're not me. You're not real." The women's faces twisted, their gentle expressions cracking like porcelain masks. "Don't fight this, Eleanor. You came here because you have nowhere else to go. No money, no family, no future except debt and shame." "Maybe," Eleanor said, backing toward the stairs. "But that's still my choice to make." She turned and ran, her pregnant body protesting every jarring step as she clawed her way up the narrow staircase. Behind her, the women's voices rose in a keening wail that seemed to shake the house's foundations. The kitchen door slammed shut just as she reached it, trapping her in the underground nursery with the hungry darkness and the 17 empty cradles. Eleanor threw her weight against the door, sobbing with frustration as it refused to budge. The baby kicked frantically inside her, as if sensing the danger they were both in. She could feel the house's attention focusing on her like a magnifying glass concentrating sunlight, burning through her defenses. "Let me out!" she screamed, pounding on the unyielding wood until her fists bled. The women had gone silent below, but she could feel them waiting. The house itself seemed to pulse around her, its hunger no longer disguised as comfort. Through the walls she could hear something moving, footsteps or heartbeats, or the settling of ancient timber that had fed on a century's worth of desperate mothers. Eleanor pressed her back against the door and slid down until she was sitting on the top step, her hands cradling her belly. The rational part of her mind catalogued their situation with forensic precision, trapped underground in a house miles from any neighbor, no cell phone signal, no one who knew where she was except federal agents who'd warned her to leave. She'd walked willingly into exactly the kind of death trap she'd spent her career helping others escape from. "I'm sorry," she whispered to her unborn daughter. "I'm so sorry I brought us here." The baby's movements had grown frantic, almost violent, as if she was trying to claw her way out of Eleanor's womb and escape the danger her mother had led them into. Eleanor could feel something changing in her body, a loosening, a shift that made her blood run cold. The stress was triggering early labor, weeks before her due date. Pain lanced through her abdomen, sharp and unmistakable. Eleanor gasped, pressing both hands to her belly as another contraction followed the first. The house had won after all. She was going to give birth here. In this trap it had baited with her own desperation, and her baby would take her place in that 18th cradle whether Eleanor survived or not. "Please," she whispered to whatever dark intelligence inhabited these walls. "Please, I'll do anything you want. Just let my baby live." The door behind her swung open so suddenly she tumbled backward onto the kitchen floor. Eleanor lay gasping on the linoleum, another contraction ripping through her as late afternoon sunlight streamed through the gingham curtains. For a moment she thought she was free, until she tried to stand and discovered she couldn't move her legs. The paralysis was creeping upward from her feet, a numbing coldness that felt like drowning in reverse. Eleanor could only lie helpless as her body prepared to deliver her child directly into the house's waiting hunger. Through the open door to the underground nursery she could hear movement, the soft creak of rocking chairs, the whisper of lullabies, the patient footsteps of women who had all once lain exactly where she lay now. The baby was coming, and there was nothing Eleanor could do to stop what happened next. The pattern was going to complete itself, just as it always had. She had lost everything: her mobility, her choices, her child's future, and any hope of escape. The house had been playing with her from the moment she'd arrived, letting her think she had agency while leading her inexorably toward this moment of absolute defeat. As another contraction ripped through her paralyzed body, Eleanor's forensic mind made one final desperate calculation. The house had been feeding her false memories, false visions, false hope, but it had also revealed something true in its eagerness to complete the pattern. The journal entry that claimed she was remembering rather than discovering, the women wearing her face, the way everything felt predetermined, it was all wrong, not because supernatural forces didn't exist in this place, but because the house had made a crucial error. It had shown her 17 cradles, 17 women, 17 decades of victims. But Eleanor had spent her career following paper trails, tracking patterns across time, and the mathematics didn't add up. "You're lying," she gasped as another wave of pain crashed over her. The paralysis had reached her waist now, but her mind was clearer than it had been since arriving. The photographs, the women, they're not spanning a century. They're all from the same decade. The house shuddered around her, a tremor that ran through the floorboards like a caught breath. Eleanor pressed her advantage, her voice growing stronger even as her body weakened. The clothing styles, the photography techniques, even the deterioration patterns. examined enough financial documents from different eras to recognize the signs. Those women all came here within years of each other, not decades apart. You're not some ancient entity, you're something that started in the 1950s. The kitchen began to shift around her, the cheerful gingham curtains flickering like a broken film reel. For a moment, Eleanor glimpsed what lay beneath the illusion: walls stained with mold and decay, broken windows, a house that had been abandoned for years. Then the 1950s facade snapped back into place, but the cracks remained visible at the edges. "And if you only started in the 1950s, Eleanor continued, her voice cutting through the house's increasingly frantic attempts to maintain its illusion, then you're not feeding on some mystical pattern, you're the result of something specific, something that happened here." The paralysis stopped spreading. Eleanor could feel sensation returning to her legs as the house's concentration wavered, its attention split between maintaining the false nursery and the kitchen illusion and whatever truth she was approaching. She forced herself to roll over, ignoring the contractions that were coming faster now, and crawled toward the kitchen drawers. Her hands shook as she pulled them open, searching for something, anything, that might be real rather than projected. In the third drawer, her fingers closed around something solid, a metal object that felt genuine in a way nothing else in this house had. A key. The moment Eleanor's skin touched the tarnished brass, the final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with brutal clarity. This wasn't a supernatural entity that had been claiming pregnant women for a century. This was the psychic imprint of a single devastating tragedy, a woman who had lost everything, including her sanity, and whose anguish had soaked so deeply into the house that it had learned to recreate her obsession. "Margaret Blackmoor," Eleanor whispered, the name surfacing from the deed paperwork she'd barely glanced at. "You lived here in the 1950s. You lost your baby." The house screamed. The sound wasn't audible. It bypassed Eleanor's ears entirely and struck directly at her brain, a keening wail of grief and rage and desperate, clawing need. The kitchen dissolved around her, revealing the truth she'd been blind to. A woman in a faded house dress standing in the corner, her face gaunt with starvation, her arms cradled around empty air. Not a ghost, not a demon. A mother who had died clutching the stillborn child she'd convinced herself was still breathing, whose love had curdled into madness so profound it had imprinted itself on reality. "The other women," Eleanor said, understanding flooding through her. "You didn't take their babies. You couldn't save them either." Margaret's hollow eyes fixed on Eleanor's face, and for the first time, Eleanor saw through the illusion that had made her believe all the victims looked like her. They hadn't. Margaret had been alone with her delusions for so long that every pregnant woman who stumbled into her domain became her lost daughter in her fractured perception. The 17 cradles hadn't held 17 babies. They'd held 17 women who had died here, some in childbirth, some from exposure, some from starvation, while Margaret rocked empty air and sang lullabies to children who existed only in her shattered mind. Eleanor gripped the key tighter, feeling its weight ground her to something real. "I'm not your daughter, Margaret, and my baby isn't your baby. We're not going to replace what you lost." The woman in the corner tilted her head, and for a moment clarity flickered in her eyes. "But you're alone," she whispered, "just like I was. No husband, no money, nowhere to go. I can keep you safe. I can keep her safe." Another contraction hit Eleanor, stronger than the others. Her baby was coming, whether she was ready or not, but now she understood what she was really fighting. Not destiny. Not patterns written in blood and stone. Just grief, powerful enough to bend reality around itself. Eleanor pressed the key against her chest, feeling its solid weight anchor her to reality, as another contraction subsided. The paralysis in her legs was completely gone now. Margaret's fractured concentration, unable to maintain the psychic hold while sustaining her desperate illusions. "I understand your pain," Eleanor said, struggling to her feet. The kitchen flickered around them, 1950s perfection bleeding into decades of decay and back again. "I lost my husband too. I know what it's like to feel like you failed the person you loved most." Margaret's hollow gaze sharpened, and for the first time, She seemed to truly see Eleanor rather than projecting her own lost daughter onto her. "He died because of my choices," Margaret whispered. "Thomas said we couldn't afford another baby, but I got pregnant anyway. When she died," her voice cracked, "he left. Said he couldn't look at me anymore." The words hit Eleanor like physical blows because she recognized the pattern. The guilt, the self-blame, the way grief could twist love into something monstrous. David had died because of financial stress, because Eleanor hadn't caught the embezzlement scheme in time. She'd spent 7 years carrying that weight, letting it hollow her out until she was almost as lost as Margaret. "But keeping other women here won't bring your baby back," Eleanor said gently. "And it won't ease the guilt. I know because I've tried everything else." Another contraction struck, this one accompanied by a rush of fluid that told Eleanor her baby was coming soon whether she was ready or not. But instead of panic, she felt something unexpected, a fierce clarity that burned through 7 years of accumulated shame and self-doubt. "I failed my husband," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "I failed to protect him from bankruptcy, from stress, from the heart attack that killed him. But I won't fail our daughter, not by letting your grief consume us both." Margaret's form wavered, becoming translucent. "She never got to live," she sobbed. "Never got to laugh or play or grow up." "How is that fair?" Eleanor felt tears streaming down her face, but they weren't tears of fear anymore. "It's not fair. None of it is. But life isn't about fairness. It's about what we choose to do with the love we still carry." She thought of David's last words, his desperate plea for her to fight for their baby. Not because he wanted her to sacrifice everything, but because he knew she had the strength to build something better than the ashes they'd been left with. Eleanor had spent 7 years believing she was running from their shared failures, but maybe she'd been running toward this moment all along, the chance to choose love over guilt, hope over grief. The key in her hand grew warm, and Eleanor suddenly knew what it opened. Not a door or a chest, but the choice Margaret had never been able to make, to let go of the past and trust the future to unfold as it would. "Help me," Eleanor said, extending the key toward Margaret. "Help me get to a hospital so my baby can be born safely. Help me break the pattern instead of repeating it." Margaret stared at the key for a long moment, her form becoming more solid as the house's illusions finally began to crumble around them. The cheerful 1950s kitchen dissolved entirely, revealing water-stained walls, broken windows, and floors littered with decades of decay. But through the destruction, Eleanor could see something else, the front door, no longer barricaded by psychic force, but simply old and warped from years of weather. "I'm so tired," Margaret whispered. "I've been holding on for so long, trying to make it right." "You can rest now," Eleanor said. "You can let go." Another contraction hit, this one strong enough to double her over. Her baby was definitely coming, but not here, not in this house built from other people's grief. Eleanor had her car keys in her pocket and enough strength left to drive to the nearest hospital. She had choices, real ones, and the will to make them. Margaret reached toward the key with fingers that were already fading. "Tell me she'll be okay. Tell me your baby will have the life mine never got." "I don't know what kind of life she'll have," Eleanor said honestly. "But I promise you, I'll love her enough for both of us, and I'll teach her that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is start over." Margaret's smile was radiant as her form finally dissolved, taking with it the psychic weight that had pressed on Blackmoor Estate for over 60 years. The house settled around them with a series of gentle creaks, no longer a trap, but simply an old building ready to crumble into the earth. Eleanor pocketed the key and walked toward the front door, each step taking her further from the grief that had nearly claimed them both. Behind her, 17 empty cradles finally fell silent. It was time to go home, not to Boston, but to whatever life she and her daughter would build together. Eleanor stepped through the front door of Blackmoor Estate and immediately doubled over as another contraction ripped through her. The October air bit at her skin, a sharp contrast to the artificial warmth of Margaret's illusions, but she welcomed the cold reality of it. Her car sat exactly where she'd left it 3 hours ago, though it felt like a lifetime had passed since she'd first walked through that door. The keys felt heavy in her trembling hands as she fumbled with the lock. Another contraction hit before she could get the door open, this one lasting nearly a full minute and accompanied by pressure that told her the baby was coming whether she made it to a hospital or not. Eleanor forced herself to breathe through the pain, drawing on 7 years of surviving the impossible. She had perhaps 20 minutes before her daughter arrived, and the nearest hospital was 30 miles away through winding Maine back roads. The mathematics were brutal and clear. She wasn't going to make it, but that didn't mean she had to give up. Eleanor managed to get the car door open and half fell into the driver's seat, her hands shaking as she started the engine. The rational part of her mind, the forensic accountant who had built a career on cold analysis, calculated distances, timing, and probability of survival. The numbers weren't encouraging, but the part of her that had just faced down 60 years of concentrated grief and won wasn't interested in statistics anymore. She pulled out of the overgrown driveway, gravel crunching under her tires as Blackmoor Estate receded in her rearview mirror. Already the house looked different, smaller, sadder, just another abandoned Victorian slowly surrendering to the elements. Without Margaret's desperate psychic energy holding it together, the building's true age was showing. By next spring, Eleanor suspected, it would be nothing but rotting timber and broken glass. The road stretched ahead of her, empty and dark under the gathering storm clouds. Eleanor gripped the steering wheel with both hands, breathing carefully through each contraction while maintaining steady pressure on the accelerator. She had her phone on the passenger seat, its screen showing no signal bars, but she kept driving towards civilization and help. 15 minutes into the drive, as the contractions grew closer together, Eleanor's phone finally picked up a weak signal. She pulled over at a scenic overlook and dialed 911 with fingers that could barely hold the device steady. 911. What's your emergency? This is Eleanor Hartwell. I'm in labor on Route 127, about 15 miles north of Millfield. I'm not going to make it to a hospital. The dispatcher's voice was calm and professional. Ma'am, I'm sending an ambulance to your location now. Are you having regular contractions? Eleanor gasped as another wave of pain crashed over her. Every 3 minutes. The baby's coming. Stay on the line with me. Help is on the way. Eleanor closed her eyes and focused on breathing, on staying present in her body instead of getting lost in panic. Through the phone, the dispatcher guided her through breathing exercises while she waited for the ambulance. The storm that had been threatening all day finally broke, rain drumming against the car's roof in a steady rhythm that somehow felt comforting rather than ominous. When she opened her eyes again, she could see headlights approaching through the rain, not one vehicle, but 3. The ambulance arrived first, followed by a state police cruiser and what looked like a fire department rescue truck. Eleanor had never been so grateful to see other human beings in her life. The EMT who opened her car door was a woman about Eleanor's age, with kind eyes and steady hands. I'm Sarah. We're going to take good care of you and your baby. They moved Eleanor to the ambulance with practiced efficiency, and within minutes she was surrounded by medical equipment and competent professionals who transformed her terrifying isolation into something manageable. The ambulance began moving toward the hospital, but Eleanor could feel her baby's determination to arrive on her own timeline. She's crowning, Sarah announced to her partner. This baby's coming now. Eleanor found herself laughing through the next contraction, not from hysteria, but from pure, unexpected joy. After everything she'd been through, after 7 years of believing she was broken and worthless, she was about to meet her daughter, not in a house built from other people's grief, but surrounded by strangers who had rushed through a storm to help her. One more push, Sarah encouraged. Eleanor bore down with everything she had left, thinking of David's voice asking her to fight for their baby, thinking of Margaret finally finding peace, thinking of all the choices that had led her to this moment. The pain crested and broke like a wave, and suddenly there was crying, not her own, but small and indignant and absolutely perfect. "It's a girl," Sarah announced unnecessarily, placing the tiny, squirming bundle on Eleanor's chest. Eleanor looked down at her daughter, red-faced and furious and completely, undeniably alive, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not the hollow ache she'd carried for 7 years, but something warm and expansive and full of possibility. "Hello, Hope," she whispered. But even as Eleanor cradled her newborn daughter against her chest, feeling Hope's tiny heartbeat flutter against her own, the warmth of the ambulance suddenly turned cold. The EMTs froze mid-motion, their faces becoming mask-like and distant. Sarah's kind eyes dulled to the same hollow stare Eleanor had seen in Margaret's photograph. "No," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible over Hope's cries. "This isn't real." The ambulance around her began to flicker like a damaged film reel. Through the gaps in the illusion, Eleanor glimpsed the truth. She was still on the floor of Blackmoor Estate's kitchen, still trapped in Margaret's desperate fantasy. Her daughter was still unborn. The contractions real, but not yet complete. The key she'd found lay cold and useless beside her hand. Margaret materialized in the corner of the false ambulance, her form more solid than before, fed by Eleanor's momentary surrender to Hope. "You see?" Margaret's voice was triumphant. "You can have everything you want here. Your daughter, safe delivery, people who care about you. Why fight when you can have perfection?" Eleanor felt the crushing weight of despair, threatening to pull her under. For a few precious moments she had believed she was free, that Hope was safe in her arms. But this was the final test, the moment when Margaret's power was strongest, when the illusion was most seductive, because it gave Eleanor everything she'd ever wanted. "Because it's not real," Eleanor said, forcing herself to look away from the beautiful lie of her healthy daughter. "And Hope deserves better than a fantasy built on other women's bones." She thought of the 17 cradles, the 17 women who had died here because they'd chosen the comfortable lie over the difficult truth. Margaret hadn't been evil. She'd been broken by loss, just as Eleanor had been. But choosing to remain broken wasn't love. It was cowardice. The fake ambulance began to dissolve around them. Eleanor found herself back in the decaying kitchen, her body racked by real contractions, her phone showing no signal. But this time, she didn't reach for the illusion of rescue. Instead, she reached for the key and understood its true purpose. "This was yours," she said, holding it up to Margaret's wavering form. "The key to your baby's nursery." Margaret's face crumpled. "I locked the door after she died. I couldn't bear to see the empty crib, the clothes we'd bought, the mobile Thomas hung from the ceiling, but I couldn't throw them away either." Eleanor struggled to her feet, another contraction threatening to buckle her knees. "And you've been trapped behind that locked door ever since, haven't you? Never grieving, never healing, just existing in the space between hope and despair." The house shuddered around them as Margaret's concentration wavered. "If I open that door, if I let myself feel it all again, I'll disappear. There'll be nothing left." "Maybe," Eleanor admitted, gasping through another wave of pain. "Or maybe you'll finally be able to rest." She extended the key toward Margaret with a hand that shook from more than just labor pains. "But I can't make that choice for you, just like you can't make my choices for me." This was it, the moment everything had been building toward. Not a battle between good and evil, but a choice between remaining safely trapped in the past or risking everything for an uncertain future. Eleanor had been making the same choice in smaller ways for 7 years, always choosing the safety of isolation over the risk of connection. Margaret stared at the key for a long moment. "What if I choose wrong? What if there's nothing after?" "Then at least you'll know," Eleanor said gently. "And at least the next woman who finds this place won't have to face what I'm facing." Another contraction hit, stronger than any before, and Eleanor felt her body preparing for Hope's arrival whether she was ready or not. But she kept her hand extended, the key glinting in the false kitchen light. Margaret's fingers, translucent and cold, closed around the metal. The moment their skin touched, Eleanor felt a jolt of shared memory. A nursery painted yellow and white, a crib with hand-carved railings, a mobile of dancing bears that would never spin for the baby who hadn't lived to see it. "I loved her so much," Margaret whispered. "I know," Eleanor said. That's why you have to let go." Margaret turned the key in her palm, and somewhere in the depths of the house, Eleanor heard the sound of a door opening for the first time in 60 years. Light flooded through the kitchen, not the harsh fluorescent glare of the 1950s illusion, but soft, natural sunlight that revealed the true state of the abandoned house. Margaret smiled as her form began to fade. "Take good care of her." "I will," Eleanor promised, and this time she meant it. The moment Margaret vanished completely, the house screamed. Eleanor felt it in her bones. 60 years of trapped anguish exploding outward like shrapnel. Windows shattered throughout the mansion, glass raining down in crystalline waterfalls. The kitchen floor buckled beneath her feet as foundation stones, no longer held together by psychic force, began to separate and shift. Blackmoor Estate was dying, and it was taking everything with it. But something else was stirring in the chaos. Eleanor felt a presence gathering in the shadows, not Margaret's lonely grief, but something older and infinitely more malevolent. The thing that had been feeding on Margaret's pain for decades, growing stronger with each woman who died within these walls. "No," a voice hissed from the collapsing walls themselves. Not Margaret's voice, but something ancient and hungry. She was mine. They were all mine. Eleanor doubled over as another contraction seized her, but through the pain she finally understood the truth. Margaret hadn't been the real enemy. She'd been a victim, just like the other 17 women. The house itself was alive, a parasite that fed on maternal grief and despair. Margaret's baby hadn't died by chance. The entity had killed her, just as it had orchestrated every subsequent tragedy. "You can't have her," Eleanor gasped, pressing her back against the crumbling wall as debris rained around her. "I won't let you." The presence laughed, a sound like breaking bones. The temperature plummeted until Eleanor could see her breath, and frost began spreading across the broken windows. "Every woman who enters this place belongs to me eventually. Your husband's death, your pregnancy, your desperate need for shelter. I arranged it all. You came here willingly, just like the others." Eleanor felt the entity's influence pressing against her mind, trying to slip inside through her exhaustion and pain. It showed her visions, David's funeral, her empty apartment, years of crushing loneliness stretching ahead if she survived this night. Wouldn't it be easier to simply surrender, to join the other women in eternal dreamless sleep? "No," Eleanor said through gritted teeth, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. Another contraction built, but instead of fighting the pain, she embraced it. This was real, her body bringing hope into the world despite everything trying to stop them. You fed on Margaret's guilt because she believed she deserved to suffer. But I don't. The house shrieked in rage, and Eleanor felt the floor tilting as the entire structure began to collapse. But she wasn't the same broken woman who had arrived here hours ago. Facing Margaret's grief had forced her to confront her own, and she'd discovered something crucial in the process. "I made mistakes," she continued, pushing herself toward the door as ceiling plaster crashed around her. "I failed to save David, failed to see the signs of his stress until it was too late. But failure isn't the same as guilt, and grief isn't the same as surrender." The entity's presence coiled around her like smoke, trying to drag her down into the collapsing foundation. Eleanor felt its desperation. After decades of feeding on women's self-blame and maternal terror, it was starving. Margaret's release had cut off its primary food source, and Eleanor's refusal to accept guilt was poison to its very nature. "You're nothing without our pain," Eleanor realized, her voice growing stronger as another contraction peaked. "You can't create suffering. You can only feed on what we give you." She reached the kitchen doorway just as the ceiling beam above her gave way. Pain exploded through her body, but not from falling debris. Hope was coming, her daughter finally ready to enter a world free from 60 years of accumulated grief. Eleanor sank to her knees in the doorway, one hand braced against the frame as her body completed the work it had started. The entity made one final, desperate attempt to claim them both. Eleanor felt its claws scraping at her mind, searching for any crack of self-doubt or fear it could exploit. But as hope crowned, as Eleanor felt her daughter's head in her hands, something extraordinary happened. Love flooded through her, not the desperate, guilty love that had trapped Margaret, but something clean and fierce and unbreakable. The love David had tried to give her in his final moments, the love she'd been too damaged to accept, the love she chose to feel for hope, not because her daughter was perfect or because Eleanor deserved happiness, but simply because love was the only response that mattered. The entity shrieked once more and dissolved like smoke in sunlight. Without its influence, Blackmoor Estate completed its collapse, walls folding inward as decades of neglect finally claimed the structure. But Eleanor barely noticed. Hope slipped into her hands with a final push, tiny and perfect and absolutely, undeniably alive. Her daughter's first cry split the morning air, and Eleanor laughed through her tears as she cradled the small, warm body against her chest. They were free. Finally, completely free. Eleanor held her daughter against her chest, feeling Hope's tiny heartbeat flutter like a bird's wings, but the moment of pure joy lasted only seconds before reality crashed back in. The house around them was collapsing in earnest now, massive timbers groaning as the roof sagged inward. They had escaped the entity, broken the cycle that had claimed 17 women before her, but they were still trapped in a building that was actively falling down around them. "We have to move," Eleanor whispered to Hope, whose cries had softened to small, mewling sounds. "I know you just got here, sweetheart, but we're not safe yet." She struggled to her feet, her body screaming in protest. Every muscle felt torn, every bone ached from the ordeal of giving birth during supernatural warfare, but she forced herself to focus on what mattered, getting her daughter to safety. The kitchen doorway where they sheltered wouldn't hold much longer. Eleanor looked around desperately for anything that could help, a blanket, a towel, anything to wrap Hope properly. But as her eyes swept the dissolving illusion of the 1950s kitchen, she realized she was facing an impossible choice. Her car keys lay somewhere in the rubble behind her, buried under fallen plaster and broken glass. Even if she could dig them out, she wasn't sure she had the strength to carry Hope all the way to the car. But there, glinting in a shaft of morning sunlight that pierced through the collapsed ceiling, she saw Margaret's locket, the one with the photograph of her baby who had never lived. Without thinking, Eleanor reached for it, and the moment her fingers closed around the silver chain, she felt a gentle presence. "Take my strength," Margaret's voice whispered, not from beyond, but from within Eleanor's own heart. "I can't stay, but I can give you what you need to save her." Eleanor felt warmth flowing through her limbs, not the false energy of supernatural influence, but something pure and freely given. Margaret's love for her lost child, transformed into the power Eleanor needed to protect Hope. It wouldn't last long. Already Eleanor could feel it beginning to fade, but it might be enough. She wrapped Hope in her own jacket and began moving through the collapsing house, guided by instinct toward the front door. Each step was agony, but Margaret's borrowed strength carried her forward. Behind her, she could hear the final death throes of Blackmoor Estate. 60 years of accumulated darkness, finally surrendering to the light. Eleanor reached the front door just as the main staircase collapsed with a sound like thunder. She stumbled outside into the crisp October morning, her legs finally giving out as she reached the overgrown lawn. They were alive, they were free, but they were also alone in the middle of nowhere with no way to call for help. That was when Eleanor realized what the sacrifice truly was. Not her life or hopes, but something else. Something precious she'd been clinging to for 7 years. Her phone had a faint signal here on the lawn, enough to place a single call. But as she stared at the screen, Eleanor understood she had a choice to make. She could call 911, pray that help arrived before exposure and her own injuries claimed them both, or she could call the one person who had been trying to reach her for months, whose number she'd deleted and blocked and tried to forget. Sarah Chen, her former colleague at the forensic accounting firm. The woman who had called every week after David's death, who had sent flowers and cards and gentle invitations that Eleanor had ignored. The friend she'd pushed away because accepting help felt too much like admitting she couldn't handle things alone. I'm going to have to give up being self-sufficient, Eleanor whispered to Hope, who had gone quiet against her chest. I'm going to have to trust someone. For 7 years, Eleanor's independence had been her armor, protecting her from the vulnerability that had led to such devastating loss. But sitting on the ground with her newborn daughter, watching the house that had nearly killed them both crumble into ruins, she realized that isolation wasn't strength. It was just another kind of prison. With trembling fingers, she dialed Sarah's number from memory. Eleanor! Sarah's voice was instantly alert despite the early hour. Oh my God, where are you? Are you all right? I'm in Maine, Eleanor said, and then the words came tumbling out. The inheritance, the house, the birth. She didn't mention the supernatural elements, just focused on the immediate crisis. I need help. We need help. I'm coming, Sarah said without hesitation. Send me your location. I'm already getting dressed. Eleanor looked down at Hope, who was watching her with dark, serious eyes that seemed impossibly aware. Did you hear that, sweetheart? Someone's coming for us. As sirens finally wailed in the distance, Sarah must have called 911 while they talked. Eleanor understood the true cost of their victory. She was free, but freedom meant giving up the walls she'd built around her heart. The ambulance arrived first, its red lights cutting through the morning mist as it navigated the rutted dirt road leading to what had once been Blackmoor Estate. Eleanor heard the sirens growing louder and felt a strange disconnection, as if she were watching someone else's rescue unfold. Hope dozed fitfully against her chest, tiny fingers occasionally flexing against Eleanor's collarbone, the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. 2 paramedics emerged from the vehicle, their faces shifting from professional concern to barely contained shock as they took in the scene. Behind Eleanor, the mansion had collapsed completely, leaving only a foundation filled with broken timbers and 60 years of accumulated secrets. Ahead of her stretched the overgrown lawn where she sat cradling her newborn, still wearing a jacket stained with birth and plaster dust. Ma'am, are you injured? The lead paramedic, a woman with graying hair and kind eyes, approached slowly. We received a call about a woman in labor. She's already here, Eleanor said, her voice hoarse from hours of screaming and supernatural terror. My daughter. Hope. The examination that followed blurred together. Gentle hands checking Hope's breathing and color, careful questions about the delivery, the efficient placement of warming blankets around both of them. Eleanor answered mechanically, providing the basic facts while carefully omitting others. How could she explain that her daughter had been born during the collapse of a haunted house? That they'd survived not through luck but through the sacrifice of a woman who had died 60 years ago? The baby appears healthy, the paramedic reported into her radio. But we need immediate transport for both mother and infant. Possible complications from unassisted birth. As they loaded Eleanor onto a stretcher, she caught sight of a familiar silver sedan racing up the driveway. Sarah had made the 4-hour drive from Boston in less than 3, and Eleanor felt something crack open in her chest as her former friend stumbled out of the car, still wearing pajama pants under her hastily thrown-on coat. Eleanor! Sarah's voice broke as she ran toward the ambulance. Oh my God! Is the baby… We're alive, Eleanor whispered, and saying it made it feel real for the first time. They had survived. Against all odds, against supernatural forces that had claimed 17 women before them, they had made it out. Sarah climbed into the ambulance without asking permission, settling beside Eleanor's stretcher with tears streaming down her face. I can't believe you went through this alone. I can't believe you didn't call me sooner. Eleanor looked down at Hope, who was sleeping peacefully in her arms despite the chaos around them. Her daughter's face was perfect. Tiny nose, dark eyebrows that would probably lighten with time, lips that pursed occasionally as if she were dreaming of nursing. No trace of the supernatural terror that had surrounded her birth, no mark left by the entity that had tried to claim them both. I'm tired of being alone, Eleanor admitted, the words scraping her throat raw. I've been alone for 7 years, and I'm tired. Sarah reached over to brush a strand of hair from Eleanor's face, and Eleanor didn't flinch away. The simple contact felt revolutionary after so long without human touch that wasn't clinical or brief. You don't have to be alone anymore. I've been waiting, we've all been waiting, for you to let us back in." As the ambulance pulled away from the ruins of Blackmoor Estate, Eleanor pressed her face to the small window for one final look. The morning sun had burned away the mist, revealing the truth of what she was leaving behind, just a collapsed Victorian mansion on a piece of Maine property that would probably be sold for timber rights. No supernatural presence lingered in the rubble. No psychic residue remained to trap the next unsuspecting visitor. Margaret was at rest. The 17 women who had died here were finally free to find whatever came after death. The cycle was broken. "What are you going to do now?" Sarah asked softly, as the ambulance turned onto the main road. Eleanor shifted hope slightly, marveling at how something so small could feel so substantial in her arms. Her apartment in Boston was too cramped for a baby, her savings account nearly empty, her future completely uncertain. 7 years ago, that uncertainty would have paralyzed her with fear. But holding her daughter, feeling Sarah's steady presence beside her, Eleanor discovered that uncertainty could also feel like possibility. "I don't know," she said, and found herself smiling. "But I won't figure it out alone." Hope stirred against her chest, tiny eyes opening to focus on Eleanor's face with an intensity that seemed impossible for someone only hours old. For just a moment, Eleanor could have sworn she saw recognition there, not supernatural awareness, but something simpler and more profound. The first spark of the bond that would define both their lives going forward. They were free and they were together, and for now, that was enough. The return. 3 weeks later, Eleanor stood in the doorway of Sarah's guest bedroom, watching Hope sleep in the borrowed crib that had appeared the day after they'd returned from Maine. The room was painted a soft yellow, gender-neutral, Sarah had explained from when her sister's family visited, and afternoon sunlight filtered through sheer curtains, casting everything in golden warmth. It was nothing like the cramped Boston apartment Eleanor had fled, and certainly nothing like the preserved perfection of Blackmoor Estate's nursery that had never held a living child. This was real. This was theirs, at least for now. "She's getting bigger," Sarah said softly from behind her, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Look at those cheeks." Eleanor accepted the tea gratefully, inhaling the familiar scent of chamomile. Sarah had remembered her preferences from their old office days, when they'd worked late into the night untangling financial fraud cases, back when Eleanor had been someone who shared details about her life, who laughed at colleagues' jokes, who didn't flinch when people got too close. "The pediatrician says she's thriving," Eleanor said. 8 pounds, 2 ounces as of yesterday. Perfect reflexes, good appetite. She paused, watching Hope's tiny chest rise and fall in the steady rhythm that still mesmerized her. "Sometimes I can't believe she's real." Sarah settled into the rocking chair that had also mysteriously appeared, another gift from the network of friends Eleanor was slowly remembering how to accept. "You look different," she observed. "Not just tired new mother, different. Actually different." Eleanor knew what she meant. The woman who had driven to Maine 3 weeks ago had been hollow, carved out by 7 years of isolation and self-blame. She'd moved through the world like a ghost, barely present even to herself. But something fundamental had shifted in those terrible hours at Blackmoor Estate. Not just surviving, though that mattered. Not just saving Hope, though that changed everything. It was what she'd discovered about herself in the darkness, that she was stronger than her failures, that love could exist without guilt, that accepting help didn't mean accepting defeat. "I keep waiting for the other shoe to drop," Eleanor admitted. "For you to get tired of having us here, or for Hope to get sick, or for me to mess everything up somehow. I spent so long believing that caring about things meant losing them. What David did wasn't your fault," Sarah said gently. It wasn't the first time they'd had this conversation. Sarah had been patient, letting Eleanor process 7 years of accumulated grief at her own pace. His depression, his financial decisions, his choice to... It wasn't your responsibility to save him. Eleanor nodded, the words settling more easily now than they had a week ago or even 3 days ago. "I know that. Intellectually, I've always known it. But knowing something and feeling it are different things. She traced the rim of her teacup with one finger. In Maine, I had to choose between staying trapped in that guilt or fighting for Hope's future, and I realized that I'd been choosing to stay trapped for years, even before the house. Hope stirred in her sleep, making the soft snuffling sounds that meant she'd wake hungry soon. Eleanor felt her body respond automatically, the physical connection between mother and child that still amazed her. Her daughter needed her, not perfectly, not without mistakes, but consistently and with love. It was the first time in 7 years that Eleanor had felt truly necessary to another person's survival. "There's something else," Eleanor said, setting down her tea. "I called my mother yesterday." Sarah's eyebrows rose. Eleanor's relationship with her family had been another casualty of David's death, another bridge burned in her retreat from the world. How did that go? Badly at first. She cried for 20 minutes. Then she got angry about me not calling sooner. Then she cried some more. Eleanor smiled despite herself. "She's driving up from Connecticut this weekend. She wants to meet her granddaughter. Are you ready for that?" Eleanor considered the question seriously. A month ago, the thought of her mother's inevitable emotional intensity, her questions and concerns and desire to help, would have sent Eleanor into panic. But she was learning to distinguish between vulnerability and weakness, between needing support and being helpless. "I think so. Hope deserves to know her grandmother, and I deserve to stop punishing people for caring about me." Through the window, Eleanor could see Sarah's neighbors going about their evening routines, walking dogs, collecting mail, calling children inside for dinner. Normal life, continuing its gentle rhythms. For 7 years, Eleanor had felt locked outside that normalcy, watching through glass she couldn't break. But sitting here with her daughter sleeping peacefully nearby and her friend's steady presence beside her, she realized the glass had been of her own making. Hope's eyes opened, dark and alert, and Eleanor felt that familiar rush of fierce protectiveness mixed with wonder. Her daughter would grow up knowing she was wanted, knowing that love could survive difficulty, knowing that asking for help was a sign of wisdom rather than failure. Eleanor reached into the crib, lifting Hope against her shoulder. "Hello, sweetheart. Ready to face the world?" Looking at her daughter's perfect, trusting face, Eleanor discovered she was ready too. The new beginning. 6 months later, Eleanor stood in the kitchen of the small house she and Hope now called home, watching her daughter discover the fascinating properties of mashed sweet potato. Hope sat in her high chair, tiny fingers exploring the orange mess with scientific determination, occasionally managing to get some into her mouth between experimental flinging motions. "I think she's going to be an artist," Eleanor's mother said from across the kitchen table, wiping sweet potato from her reading glasses with amused resignation. "Look at that color coordination." Eleanor laughed, reaching over to clean Hope's face with a damp cloth. Her daughter immediately grabbed for the cloth, babbling in the serious tone she used when she had important things to communicate. At 8 months old, Hope was all curiosity and energy, crawling everywhere and pulling herself up on furniture with the fearless determination of someone who had never learned that the world could be dangerous. "More like a scientist," Eleanor countered. "She's clearly testing the aerodynamic properties of baby food." The house was a small rental 20 minutes from Sarah's place, with hardwood floors that creaked in friendly ways and windows that let in actual sunlight. Eleanor had found it through a colleague at the new accounting firm where she'd started working part-time, a compromise that let her contribute to their household while still being present for Hope's daily discoveries. The firm specialized in helping small businesses recover from financial difficulties, and Eleanor had discovered that her experience with loss made her better at her job, not worse. She understood the shame and fear that came with financial crisis and could guide clients through recovery with genuine empathy. Her mother had driven up from Connecticut every other weekend since that first visit, gradually becoming an integral part of their new routine. Eleanor had forgotten how good her mother was in a crisis, how her intensity could feel supportive rather than overwhelming when Eleanor stopped fighting it. Today's visit was different, though. Her mother was staying for a full week while Eleanor attended a conference in Portland, the first time she'd left Hope overnight since Maine. "Are you nervous?" her mother asked, correctly interpreting Eleanor's frequent glances toward the conference materials spread across the counter. Terrified, Eleanor admitted. Not about the work. I know I can handle the presentations, but being away from her... She trailed off, watching Hope successfully navigate a spoonful of sweet potato to her mouth with a look of triumph. That's normal. Healthy, even. Her mother reached over to squeeze Eleanor's hand. 7 years ago, I wasn't sure you'd ever let yourself care about anything this much again. Eleanor knew what she meant. The woman who had driven to Blackmoor Estate had been so afraid of loss that she'd avoided love entirely. But loving Hope had taught her something crucial. The risk of loss didn't diminish the value of love. It made love more precious, not less. Every day with her daughter was a choice to be present, to be vulnerable, to believe that the good outweighed the potential for pain. I kept David's wedding ring for 7 years, Eleanor said suddenly. She'd never told her mother about finally removing it 2 months ago, or about the small ceremony she'd held in their backyard, burying the ring under the apple tree where Hope liked to play. I thought keeping it meant I loved him, but really, I think I was keeping my guilt. Her mother nodded slowly. Grief makes us do strange things. The important part is recognizing when holding on stops being love and starts being fear. Hope banged her spoon against her high-chair tray, clearly finished with sweet potato and ready for the next adventure. Eleanor lifted her daughter into her arms, breathing in the sweet scent of baby shampoo and that indefinable smell that was purely Hope. Her daughter immediately reached for Eleanor's earrings, another favorite investigation target. Sarah called this morning, Eleanor said as she settled Hope on her lap. She's been offered a promotion that would mean relocating to Chicago. How do you feel about that? Sad, Eleanor said honestly, but also grateful. She gave us exactly what we needed when we needed it, and now she deserves her own next chapter. She kissed the top of Hope's head. Besides, we're not the same people who needed rescuing 6 months ago. It was true. The woman sitting here now could handle Sarah's absence, could maintain the friendships she'd rebuilt, could trust that love didn't disappear just because geography changed. Eleanor had learned to be alone without being isolated, to be independent without being closed off. Hope looked up at her with dark eyes that sparkled with mischief, then reached deliberately toward the bowl of remaining sweet potato. Eleanor laughed and moved it out of range, earning a look of profound disappointment from her daughter. What do you think, sweetheart? Eleanor asked. Ready for whatever comes next? Hope responded by blowing a raspberry, which Eleanor chose to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. Outside, the late afternoon sun painted their kitchen golden, and Eleanor could hear neighborhood children playing in the park across the street. Normal sounds of a normal life she'd never expected to claim. For the first time in 8 years, Eleanor felt fully present in her own life, not running from the past or dreading the future, but existing completely in this moment with her daughter in her arms and love surrounding them both. They were home,